His hands were not steady. For a man who had spent his adult life in scholarship, in the careful handling of ancient texts, in the precise discipline of theological reasoning, the trembling was noticeable. The tablet sat on the desk in front of him in the lamplight of his private study, and Pope Leo XIV stood over it the way a person stands at the edge of something they cannot fully see the bottom of. He had been translating for 72 hours. He had barely slept. The translation was finished. And what it said was the reason his hands would not stop moving. In 3 days he would stand before the College of Cardinals. In 4 days he would stand before the world. 2,000 years of institutional history were about to encounter something that had been waiting, sealed in stone, beneath the oldest basilica in Christendom, for exactly this moment. He did not know yet whether he was equal to it. He prayed that he would be. This is the story of what was found, what it said, and what happened when a pope decided that some truths cannot be managed, they can only be delivered. To understand what was discovered beneath St. Peter's Basilica, you need to understand what was being looked for and why the search had been conducted in silence. The Vatican's preparation for the Jubilee year had provided legitimate cover for extensive structural work beneath the basilica. Engineers, restoration specialists, and conservators had been moving through the subterranean levels of one of the most archaeologically layered sites in human history, with the careful patience that such places require. Officially, the work was stabilization and preservation. The public announcements described routine maintenance of ancient foundations. Unofficially, a much smaller and much more carefully controlled excavation was proceeding in a specific section of the sub-foundations, based on information that had been developing quietly for several years inside the Vatican's restricted archival collections. The documents that pointed toward the chamber had been found not through any dramatic discovery, but through the patient, unglamorous work of archival scholarship. A team of historians working on the digitization of Vatican manuscript collections had flagged a cluster of early-period texts that, read together, described a sealed location beneath what was then a much earlier structure on the site of the current basilica. The texts were fragmentary. They required substantial cross-referencing. They took 3 years to interpret with sufficient confidence to act on. What they described, consistently across multiple independent sources, was a chamber sealed during the first generation of the Christian community in Rome. Sealed, not because of what had been placed inside it in the way that objects are stored, but in the specific manner reserved for things considered too significant, too dangerous in the wrong hands, too far ahead of their time to be released into a world not yet ready to receive them. The decision to excavate had been made by Leo XIV personally. Within his first month in the chair of Peter, he had reviewed the archival material himself. He had consulted with 2 scholars outside the Vatican whose discretion he trusted completely, and he had authorized the search with the precise instruction that it be conducted without announcement and without involving the larger administrative apparatus of the Curia. He had his reasons for that instruction. They were good reasons. The next several weeks would confirm how good. The excavation team was small, 6 people in total, led by an archaeologist named Professor Margherita Santori, who had spent 30 years working on first-century Mediterranean sites, and whose reputation for methodological rigor was exceeded only by her capacity for discretion. She had been approached directly by the Pope's secretary. She had been given the archival material to review. She had asked 2 questions: how much time, and how many people would know. When she received the answers she considered acceptable, she agreed. For 11 weeks, the team worked in pre-dawn hours, before the ordinary excavation crews arrived, in a section of the sub-foundations that had been closed off from the general renovation work, on the basis of a structural assessment report that was technically accurate and strategically timed. The Vatican is a place where paperwork moves faster when it is signed by the right offices. Cardinal Renato Ferraro, one of the 2 senior figures the Pope had brought into partial confidence, had ensured that the necessary documentation existed and that it did not invite questions. On the morning of the 83rd day, at 4:47 in the morning, Professor Santori called the single number she had been given for exactly this circumstance. "We have found the entrance," she said. The Pope's secretary answered and wrote down the time. Leo XIV was in the tunnel 40 minutes later. He had insisted on seeing it immediately, which had produced a cautious objection from the head of his security detail and a rather more pointed objection from Cardinal Ferraro, who had been woken by the call and had arrived at the site with the slightly wild-eyed energy of a man who has rushed somewhere in the middle of the night and has not yet fully made peace with the fact that he is there. The proper protocols, Ferraro had said, would suggest a staged approach, a safety assessment, verification of atmospheric conditions. Leo had listened to all of this, and then walked into the tunnel. The passage leading to the chamber was narrow and lower ceilinged than the surrounding excavation, which Professor Santori attributed to its deliberate concealment within the original foundation structure. Whoever had sealed this space had taken considerable care to ensure it would not be discovered by accident. The entrance had been disguised as a structural element. A section of foundation wall that was in fact a sealed door fitted so precisely into the surrounding stonework that 11 weeks of careful excavation had been required to identify its outline with confidence. The team had introduced fresh air into the space gradually over the preceding 48 hours in preparation for entry. The atmospheric conditions had been assessed. Everything Professor Santori required for responsible entry had been done. What she could not prepare for, and what she later said in a private debrief, was the quality of the stillness inside the chamber. It was not the ordinary stillness of a closed space. It was the stillness of something that had been waiting. The chamber was small, perhaps 4 meters by 3, with a ceiling low enough that a tall person would need to be careful. The walls were bare stone, undecorated, with no paintings, no inscriptions, no ornamentation of any kind. At the center of the chamber, on a simple stone plinth that had been cut from the same material as the floor, stood the tablet. It was approximately 40 centimeters square, perhaps 4 centimeters thick, made of a pale grey stone that the work lights illuminated with a quality that Professor Santori immediately noted was unusual. Not unusual in a supernatural sense, she was careful to be precise about this, but unusual in the sense that the material did not reflect light the way any stone she had previously encountered reflected it. It absorbed light differently, held it differently. She would write in her formal assessment that the visual quality of the material was unlike any stone she had observed in 30 years of archaeological fieldwork. The surface of the tablet was covered on one face with script. Ancient Aramaic, she confirmed within minutes, the particular form associated with the first-century communities of the Eastern Mediterranean. But interspersed throughout the Aramaic text were symbols that she did not recognize, and had not encountered in any published catalogue of early Christian inscriptions. They were precise, clearly intentional, and appeared at regular intervals throughout the text, in a pattern that suggested they were not decorative, but functional. A form of notation whose purpose would require further analysis. Leo stood before it for a long time without speaking. Cardinal Ferraro, at his shoulder, said very quietly, "Can you read any of it?" The Pope leaned closer. His knowledge of ancient languages was not amateur. He had studied Biblical Aramaic formally, and had continued that study throughout his years in Peru, where the engagement with original texts had been a consistent element of his scholarly life. He read in silence for several minutes. Then he straightened and turned to Professor Santori. He asked her a single question. How quickly could the tablet be safely transported to the Apostolic Palace? She said 48 hours if they were careful. He said, "Be careful." For 3 days after the tablet was installed in his private study, the Pope was effectively unreachable. His scheduled appointments were cancelled with the explanation that he was engaged in important theological research. His meals arrived and were taken away largely untouched. The small circle of people who had been admitted to knowledge of the discovery were instructed to remain available, but not to contact him unless something urgent arose that could not wait. Father Vidal, his secretary, delivered meals and correspondence, and managed the flow of inquiries from the Curia with the steady discretion of a man who has learned that the most useful thing a secretary can do during a pope's period of intense, private work is to make the outside world feel managed, while leaving the inside world undisturbed. On the morning of the 4th day, Leo summoned Cardinal Ferraro and Professor Santori. They found him standing by the window in the early light, the tablet on the desk behind him in its protective case. He had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to someone who has arrived, after great effort and much internal argument, at a decision. "I have completed the translation," he said. Neither of them spoke. He turned. His expression was not the expression of triumph or revelation that either of them had perhaps unconsciously anticipated. It was something more weighted and more sober than that. The expression of a man who has received news that is important and true, and that carries with it a cost. "The inscription," he said, "opens with a declaration of origin. It states that the words recorded on the tablet were delivered by a messenger, and the specific term used in the Aramaic is the term for a divine emissary, a messenger from outside the categories of human speech." He paused. The name given is the name that appears in the traditions of multiple faiths as the messenger who delivers communications of singular significance to human history. The name is Gabriel. Cardinal Ferraro sat down. Leo continued. The text was recorded by an early disciple who is identified by name but whose name does not appear in the canonical documents we possess. The tablet states that it was sealed and preserved for a time when the community built in the name of the message, meaning the Church, would have become so focused on its own architecture that it had begun to lose contact with the reason the architecture was built in the first place. He looked at them both. "The message," he said, "is a call to return." The authentication process had been running in parallel with the translation, conducted by Professor Santori and two outside specialists, whose discretion had been secured through arrangements that left no administrative trail. The results, delivered to Leo on the morning after his translation was complete, were unambiguous on the points that scientific method could address. The tablet dated to the 1st century. The Aramaic script was authentic to the period. The notation symbols, when compared against two other artifacts held in the Vatican's most restricted collections that had never been published or publicly described, proved to be a recognized but extremely rare form of inscription reserved. According to the internal documentation accompanying those restricted artifacts, for texts of divine rather than human authorship, the early Christian community had possessed a system for distinguishing, in written form, between what a human being had composed and what a human being had recorded from a source beyond themselves. The symbols on this tablet designated it as the second category. The material composition of the stone produced the result that Professor Santori had felt she needed to deliver personally, rather than in writing. The mineral structure of the tablet did not correspond to any known geological source. It did not match any quarry, any regional deposit, any documented stone type, from anywhere in the Mediterranean basin, from anywhere in Europe, from anywhere in the known geological record. She placed the analysis on Leo's desk and looked at him steadily. "I am a scientist," she said. "I describe what the evidence shows. The evidence shows that this stone has no terrestrial origin that I can identify." Leo looked at the report for a long time. Then he said, "Thank you, Margarita. Please keep this specific finding between us for now." The politics had been building while the science was being conducted. The Vatican is an institution of considerable age and considerable experience with the management of information, and the management of information inside the Vatican is a skill that is cultivated over careers and passed between generations of curial officials with the seriousness of a craft. When a pope begins cancelling appointments, when archivists and linguistic specialists are observed entering the apostolic palace at unusual hours, when a senior cardinal who is known for measured behavior is seen in what appears to be heated private discussion with the Pope in the Vatican gardens, the institution's information management apparatus activates automatically. The Secretary of State, Cardinal Pio Damiani, arrived for his weekly briefing with a careful expression and a carefully prepared set of observations. He said that there were concerns. He said that the Curia was aware of unusual activity. He said that matters of significance to the Church as a whole required the involvement of the appropriate bodies. His language was diplomatic, which is to say that his language was simultaneously inoffensive and completely clear. Leo listened to all of it. Then he said that in 3 days he would address the College of Cardinals. Everything would be explained. He asked for patience and prayers until then. After Damiani left, Leo sat at his desk for a long time thinking about the resistance that was already forming before the content of what he had found had even been shared. He had expected it. He was an American who had spent most of his adult life in Peru and who had arrived in the chair of Peter without the accumulated relationship debts and institutional loyalties that the Roman Curia expected a pope to carry. He had been a problem from the first week, in the specific way that a person who is genuinely indifferent to being liked by the right people is always a problem for institutions whose internal coherence depends on the social management of information. He was not indifferent to the people. He simply refused to let his management of them be governed by their comfort, rather than by what was true. That distinction had defined his career. It was about to define something considerably larger. The morning of the consistory arrived with the clear, cold light of a Roman spring, the sky the particular shade of pale blue that makes the old stones of the city look as though they were built specifically to be seen against it. The cardinals assembled in their red robes with the gravity of men who had been told that what they were about to hear was significant, but who had not been told what it was. Leo entered and placed on the table before him the leather portfolio containing his prepared remarks, and beside it, in its glass case, the tablet. He began with the discovery. He described the excavation with the precision of a scholar who respects his audience's intelligence. He described the authentication process without elision, acknowledging what science could confirm and what it could not. He described the translation in the methodical sequence of someone who knows that the architecture of how you deliver information is as important as the information itself. Then he read the message. The response was not uniform. It could not have been uniform. What the message called for was not a minor adjustment. It called for a re-examination of the relationship between the institution and the people it served. It called for the priority of the living reality of pastoral encounter over the accumulated weight of administrative tradition. It called for the kind of radical hospitality that the earliest communities had practiced before the infrastructure of a global institution had made hospitality a program rather than a posture. Some of the cardinals in the room heard this as an invitation. Others heard it as a threat. Cardinal Enzo Brenzi, who led the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and who had the specific institutional experience of a man who has spent decades determining what the Church does and does not contain, rose and said in a voice carrying the full authority of his office that no artifact, regardless of its provenance or its claimed authorship, could overturn 2 millennia of defined doctrine. Leo did not argue. He said, "Examine the tablet. Verify the authentication. Then let us speak again." The debate continued for hours beyond the scheduled time. Questions were raised, some procedural, some theological, some that were neither but were the kind of questions that people ask when they are afraid and are looking for the specific form of argument that will make the fear manageable. Leo answered each one with the patience of someone who has done the work and is not threatened by the questions because he has already asked them of himself. At noon he stood on the balcony above St. Peter's Square. The crowd below was larger than ordinary, drawn by the announcement that something significant was about to be declared, shaped by weeks of speculation into the particular expectant quality of a crowd that has gathered, because it senses that the moment is real rather than merely scheduled. Leo described the discovery. He described what had been found, and what it had taken to reach certainty about it. He held up the glass case with the tablet visible inside, and he said clearly, for the cameras and the translators and the billions of people who would encounter these words in the hours that followed, that what they were looking at was a message recorded in the 1st century at the instruction of the Archangel Gabriel, preserved beneath this place for 2,000 years, and delivered now to a world that the message itself had anticipated would be waiting for it. The square did not produce a single unified response. It produced the full range of what humanity produces when it encounters something it cannot immediately process. There were tears. There were arguments. There were people on their knees, and people with their phones raised, and people who simply stood very still with the expression of those who are determining whether what they have just heard is the thing they have been waiting for without knowing they were waiting for it. In Boston, where Leo had grown up, people gathered outside the cathedral in a crowd that had assembled without organization, without announcement, drawn by the particular gravity of a moment that a city recognizes as its own. In Jerusalem, at sites where multiple traditions converge on the same geography of the sacred, people paused in the strange simultaneous awareness that something had happened that did not belong to any single community. In the Vatican itself, the night was not quiet. It was full of the specific activity of an institution processing a shock to its foundations, which is to say it was full of urgent conversations in corridors, of messages moving between offices, of a handful of people celebrating and a larger number trying to determine whether what had just occurred required a strategy. Leo was in his private chapel. Cardinal Ferraro found him there. "The opposition is organizing," Ferraro said. "The traditionalist bloc is calling for an independent commission to re-examine the authentication. Several bishops' conferences have already requested guidance." "Let them examine it," Leo said. "The tablet does not change under examination. Truth has that quality." He looked at the ancient stone in its case. "What was sealed down there for 20 centuries was not sealed by accident," he said. "It was sealed because the people who put it there understood something that we understand too, when we are honest with ourselves. That the world is not always ready for what is true. That sometimes the most protective thing you can do for a truth is to wait for the moment when the world can receive it rather than simply defend against it." He turned. "That moment is now," he said, "whether the institution is ready or not." In the days that followed, the world divided along the lines that the tablet's message had apparently anticipated. Scholars disputed. Bishops debated. Theologians produced arguments of considerable sophistication in both directions. Social media generated the specific heat of a topic that is simultaneously too important to ignore and too complex to reduce to the form that social media requires. Professor Santori submitted her final authentication report to a restricted Vatican archive and a simultaneously sealed copy to a legal depository outside Italy, the address of which she had communicated to Leo privately before doing so. She did not explain the reason for the redundancy. She did not need to. He thanked her with the brevity of two people who understand each other. Late at night in his private journal, Leo wrote about what he believed he had been given and what it required of him. He wrote that he was not certain of many things, not certain of his own adequacy to the moment, not certain of how the institutional resistance would resolve, not certain of the timeline of what the message called for. He was certain of one thing only, that the tablet had been in the ground for 2,000 years, and that it had come out of the ground now, in this moment, into the hands of the first pope from the Americas, a man who had spent his formation years in the dust of Peru, learning that the gospel, as he had once said, smells like sweat before it smells like incense. He had not asked for this. He had authorized the search because the archival evidence pointed toward something real, and because he believed, on professional and theological grounds, that real things should be investigated rather than avoided. He had not expected to find what was there. He had not expected the translation to say what it said. He had not expected to be standing on a balcony above St. Peter's Square, holding up a stone that a geologist could not identify as being from this earth. He was standing there now. Outside his window, Rome was luminous in the darkness, its ancient stones holding light the way they always had, the way they had been holding light since before the church existed, since before the empire existed, since before the earliest communities gathered in these streets and tried to figure out how to live by something that had changed them beyond their capacity to fully explain. The tablet was on his desk. The translation was complete. The message was in the world. Whatever came next would come. He closed the journal. He turned off the lamp. He knelt in the dark and stayed there for a long time, in the silence that precedes the days that change history, which is the same silence that precedes all other days, and that most of us, most of the time, are not still enough to hear. Like and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. These stories reach the people who need them because of you.